Hello, and YouTube tells me that we have gone live on this stream. So if you could confirm that for me, if you are in the chat, I would very much appreciate it. I will also warn you that I'm getting a few dings on my various internet connection alerts, so we may have some echoing or some robotic voicing, which I apologize for, but hey, it's 2020 and you never know what the internet's going to do at any given time. Now, this is an unexpected live event from Hoeg Law here. As everyone knows, you go to your favorite law firm for video game postmortems, just like you go to your law firm for movie reviews. And here we have just finished, as of maybe 2 hours ago, by far my most anticipated video game of the year, and that's Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, if you aren't familiar with it, is supposedly, and believe me, we will get to that, a remake of the Final Fantasy VII video game that was released originally, at least here in America, on September 7th, 1997. And if you can believe it, the reason I know that date so much by heart is because Final Fantasy VII took place or was released at a time in my life that was very unique. I was in high school. It was really the first video game that I got hyped for. I purchased for myself. It was a pre-order that I kept in my wallet for, I think, the better part of a full year. I think I might have pre-ordered it in September of 1996 from my local electronics boutique. And so with that as kind of the background, the tilt here, this is a very important game to me, and Square Enix had teased the existence of a Final Fantasy VII project of some kind for generations now, from the PlayStation 3 tech demo to show off what they could do with real-time animation, showing the Midgar pullback from the start of this video game, all the way through a number of separate teases that Square Enix had for whether or not they would make a Final Fantasy VII Remake project, whether they had the resources to make high-definition role-playing games in that light, all the way up till, I believe it was 5 years ago at this point in time, that they finally said, we're going to keep our promise and release a Final Fantasy VII Remake project, which slowly kind of came into focus as being what was released this past Friday. And what was released this past Friday was the first part of Final Fantasy VII, the original from 1997. And they kind of made that known as part of their marketing efforts over the last little while, that they would only be doing the Midgar section of Final Fantasy VII, the original. And that section in the original game, I've heard different hourly quotes on this. I usually think about it as about a 5-hour section of the game before the world opens up and you go and you proceed into your normal Final Fantasy-ness and explore the world and have all the good stories that lay outside of this one city. And so they were only going to do this one city, and a lot of people had questions about exactly how much they would wind up doing. And as it turns out, they made a full-fledged game out of Midgar. It's 35 plus hours long, and it is absolutely excellent. Was going to go on my list potentially of one of the best games ever made. And I was thinking while I was playing this game that if they finished this project, if they continued with the rest of Final Fantasy VII, and they actually put the resources and they didn't freak out about sales on Part 2 or anything else, that we might be bearing witness to one of the best, most ambitious projects in video game history, and I was along for the ride. And then today happened. Today happened with respect to the last half of the last chapter. This is something akin to a long-distance runner getting to the very end and falling down on their face before the finish line, and it's just so frustrating. And I've said all that without spoilers because I wanted to give everybody kind of the heads up. I've obviously got this tweet highlighted for my thoughts on the general kind of concepting of what Final Fantasy VII Remake is as a project. And I just wanted to talk about it with you all to maybe get some other people's thoughts. This is going to be a fairly loose, I think, version of a postmortem. I've got some notes as to the things that I want to highlight, that I want to talk about. But I also want to respond to chat if you have any of your own thoughts. And before we dive into anything specific at all, I want to give the world's biggest spoiler warning. Like, I can't make a spoiler warning big enough for this because the Final Fantasy VII Remake project is not really necessarily a Final Fantasy VII Remake. And they we're having fun with some wordplay there. And before you hear any more, I want you to get out of here. If you're at all interested in this, if you're like me, if you had that pre-order in 96 and 97 in your pocket, in your wallet, and you were so happy about it, reading all those magazine spreads, and then the game came out and it actually met and exceeded those high expectations, savor that. Maybe keep that. Maybe don't come back to this project, at least until we know more about where it's all going. But if you're at all interested, if you've already completed the game, if you want to dive in with me, the spoiler alert is over. You've had your chance. And now we're going to talk about everything. So first, I want to talk about what I really, really liked about this game. So as I said, as I was going through this thing, it was going to be one of my favorite video game projects of all time. Final Fantasy VII is a great game, but Final Fantasy VII isn't a perfect game, and part of that is because of its place in time. And a lot of people talk about the technology, and that's very true, but also it was about the translation. We weren't in a place in video gaming where we were getting a lot of nuance, a lot of specific characterization. Everything had to be hammers and sledgehammers because you had a very limited text box and you were having some transliteration effects across the Japanese-English barrier. And so one of the things that this does so brilliantly, so well, and I want to give credit to Tetsuya Nomura, the director of this game and one of the directors of the original Final Fantasy VII, for all of that, because I'm also going to have some other words for him later, is that the characterization here is spot on, and not spot on so far as it's copying what happened in 1997, but instead the much better version of a remake or reboot, or as we will see, a reimagining, in that it takes the spirit of what you knew about Final Fantasy VII. It takes what you think you know. Cloud is a kind of terse mercenary who's trying to be cool. What you think you know about Aerith and Tifa and everyone else involved in the Final Fantasy VII game, and expands on it in such an organic way that you really feel like you are watching a long-form HBO or Netflix series that can really dive into these different nuances of the characters and the characterization. And that's such a gift for someone that really thoroughly loves the original project, to actually see these people come to life, yes, in Unreal 4 and with all the graphics and flash and sparkly effects that you would want, but also just in the dialogue. And Square Enix has finally, I think, cracked the code of how to make a high-definition RPG, allowing you to walk through these towns and have these discussions, or at least listen in on these discussions and get all this nuance and character of what's happening in Slum 5 and Slum 7, in Midgar in general. And it's so well done. And yes, it's still Square Enix, so there's still technical issues. There's still people talking over each other. You literally have cutscenes where if you're close enough to somebody else that has one of these kinds of ambient conversation events that you hear them at the same time, it's a little problematic to pay attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. But it's such a kind of endearing kind of logistical issue that is so much a part of Square Enix and Final Fantasy VII, or Final Fantasy in general at this point, that didn't really bug me too much. And it was so nice to get that context, and these people change their conversations as the plot goes on. It's so, so good. And that maintains a consistency of the world. It's a very grounded environment. It's a very enjoyable place to explore and to be in. It feels like a place in a way that Final Fantasy 13 doesn't, in a way that Final Fantasy 15 doesn't. And yeah, a lot of that is we're looking back to Square Enix's writing heyday. Final Fantasy 6 and 7, for my money, are some of the best that they ever put out there. And essentially having that source material, having that material very much like Game of Thrones, where you have those books, where you have something that is beloved, that has kind of gone through all the motions of figuring out its nooks and crannies, what its characters are, so helped this project and avoided some of the pitfalls of modern-day Square Enix, where everything is Destiny and giant tornado monsters and black versus white and whatever the living hell Kingdom Hearts 3 turns into at the end of that game. I still can't unpack that, and I'm not sure there's anything to unpack. So it avoids all of that brilliantly, and you say, Square Enix has figured it out. Let's just have them do this for every game they released before, say, 2010, and they can live off those profits for 3 solid decades, because I'll play Final Fantasy VI Remake, I'll play Final Fantasy IV Remake, I'll play Final Fantasy VIII Remake. You guys can sell these to me forever. You'll have a recurring revenue stream just from Hoeg Law. Alas, we'll get to that. The other thing is Final Fantasy VII is imagery is so iconic. Midgar is so iconic. You can see a picture like this and you can know exactly what game you're talking about. It is such a wonderful environment that has survived all of these video game icons. It reminds me very much of something like Rapture and BioShock and all these various other places that you think of as just having this visual panache and putting it in a modern engine with all of these effects and all of this import and making you feel like you're in it, that menus fall away when you're just kind of walking forward and really inside the environments is magnificent. It's everything anybody that has seen those pre-rendered stills as the background for the original Final Fantasy VII could want as part of the project. And it is exactly as advertised, and it's great. It's great. It's great to see something that you love, that I love personally, have this amount of resources thrown at it. The manpower, the money, everything else that goes into a project like this is unfathomable. And it is so great to see. I was getting into the last chapters of the game yesterday, and we were in Shinra headquarters, me and my daughter, and it was so cool to see the museum and to see that audio-visual display that they had of the background of the ancients and all this stuff that they had done to kind of really bring it into the modern era. And my daughter was saying, wow, this place is so cool, Shinra headquarters. And I remember thinking this place is so cool in 1997. And that's really almost priceless, and I really thank them for that. The biggest difficulty that I thought that they would have would be with respect to the battle system, because Square Enix has essentially abandoned, at least in their Final Fantasy franchise, the turn-based battle system that really marked the middle and really high point of Final Fantasy in general, and they got rid of that. And I was really worried about that up until E3 last year, where they kind of announced what they were going to do with this essentially action-based combat, but still requiring a lot of menu manipulation by essentially allowing you to fill your active time battle gauges by hitting things. It really combined what was Final Fantasy XV's kind of dumb person's approach to action with the old-timey, turn-based, kind of higher-level strategy action of the original Final Fantasy series in a way that was brilliant. This is the best battle system they have put out there since Final Fantasy XIII. And I will say I love Final Fantasy XIII's battle system, but I love it in a way that is pretty separate from the rest of the Final Fantasy franchise. And this feels like Final Fantasy. It feels difficult in a way that is still manageable. It feels like spinning plates that are very pretty, and bouncing between people is so fast and so responsive and so fluid. I feel cool every time that I'm battling something in this game, which is a heck of a trick, right? So they hit all of the narrative beats from the original game. They hit the imagery. They have wonderful music. They have these great new renditions of all these themes that I really love, including a lot of kind of pulling from later themes and putting them into this game because they had the ability to do that. They know everything that was popular. They know what they want to essentially hint at later on in this game. And they wind up putting it directly into all these other themes in a fashion that I just absolutely adored. I actually sat on the title screen when this game first came out and said, hey, this new crystal theme, the main theme of the title screen to a number of Final Fantasies, but Final Fantasy VII in this particular case, is so gorgeous. It's got drums, it's got horns, it's got all this great stuff that I just absolutely loved. I let it sit on the title screen for probably a solid 10 minutes before I even hit start to start the game. So that's the good stuff, right? You've got a good story. I will say you've got a good 17 and a half chapters of story, but as I said, it's an 18-chapter game. And you've got a great battle system in great environments with great characters and characterization. And you could see why I was literally sitting there going, this is probably my favorite game since The Witcher 3, and I can't believe that they pulled this off, that they made somebody happy that has this original game from 1997 that is so important to them. But there's some negatives. And before we get to the main one, that's the second half of Chapter 18 of this story, I want to get to a few of them out of the way. And maybe they don't bother you, maybe they won't bother you. But one of them is swearing, right? So Final Fantasy, not really known for its swearing, not high-level swearing. This isn't an HBO show. This isn't something that you can only see on YouTube. But it's a lot. It's often. I was actually keeping track in the middle of the game a little bit about essentially how many lines in a row could have a swear word or some other kind of unacceptable language in Hoeg House in a row in one of these scenes where actually nothing much is happening. This is just two people conversing. And you could make the argument, I think it's a warranted argument to some extent, that the people in the slums are more used to coarse language. They use it more often. And so they're trying to kind of articulate differences in characterization and differences in treatment and how people feel with that language. Even giving that as kind of an assumption and saying, okay, maybe that makes some sense. They do it a lot. And the other kind of pro that goes with this game is that I was getting to experience it really for the first time with my daughter and getting to talk about all this stuff. Getting to talk about all the things that I loved in 1997, talk about the character, talk about where the plot is going. And we're not prudes at Hoeg House, but she's 10 and it was a little much. And essentially all the time I was saying, hey, language Barrett or language whomever, and, don't repeat any of this to your mother because I'll get in trouble and things along those lines. But it was a little much, and it's not really necessary for the game in the great extent that it is in the game. And so I would have loved to see that either come down or maybe even have, other games do, some kind of bleeping option for some of that stuff. And hey, maybe that's specific to me. Maybe you don't care about it at all. But I do think it takes you out of what can be a very useful kind of fun family experience with a game that has a lot of things to say about, the environment and nature and science and all this other good stuff that is somewhat lost if you have any sensitivity to that. And frankly, I don't have a ton of sensitivity to that, but in the middle of playing this with my 10-year-old daughter, I was like, well, okay, choices were made. She's learning a few new things in vocabulary, and we'll talk about when not to use those things. There's also little stuff that you can expect from these kinds of games. The side quests, I think, flesh out some of the characters and some of the game's locations pretty well, but they're pretty boring. For the most part, it's go here, kill some rats, go here, kill this other thing, maybe collect some stuff. Pretty annoying when there are no location markers on your map and you just kind of have to run around and figure out where things are. But they don't really harm anything, and it's really just there if you want to have that experience go on and have more time with the game. So it doesn't really bug me, but it doesn't add a lot, and Square Enix was pushing that out there in terms of marketing a great deal, and it didn't really coalesce into something that I think was too terribly valuable. Now, the elephant in the room. We're going to spend the rest of this time, after I check in on the chat here, talking about the ending of the game, because a number of people say, hey, endings shouldn't take too much away from whatever it is that you enjoyed in something. We think of conversations that people have had with respect to maybe Game of Thrones, maybe older television series like Lost or Battlestar Galactica. Maybe it's not an ending, but a continuation that bothers you, and people say, just forget about that kind of thing. Maybe it's the Disney sequels to the Star Wars legacy that you have, and you say, hey, I don't really like those things, but you can still like the things that came before. And one of the things that I will say here is that nothing that I'm about to talk about with respect to this ending in Final Fantasy VII, nothing that I'm about to say is going to change any of what came before in 97. The existence of this game, this Final Fantasy Remake project, doesn't change the fact that Final Fantasy VII 1997 exists. However, it does somewhat seem like Square Enix is laughing at us as you get into what the ending actually does. And the ending of this particular game attempts to reframe what has gone before. The story that you are getting, the story that you are experiencing, the story that Square Enix is trying to sell you. And I'm not saying that should color the experiences that came before entirely. Everything up until halfway through chapter 18, I adored. And I'll always have that. If my party never decides to go through that portal on that highway into Kingdom Hearts land, then we can just call it quits. We can say, hey, that portal never happened. Sephiroth never showed up. They took their motorcycle and their little car. They drove down the highway and they left Midgar, and we can pick it up in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Yay. Except that isn't what really happened. And as we talk about what did happen, it's going to become clearer that Final Fantasy VII Remake is a bit of a play on words. The reason it's not called Part 1, the reason it's not called Midgar, is because what they are actually building here, it would seem, and I will issue the disclaimer here that says Tetsuya Nomura has a lot going for him. He does some interesting character designs. He, as I said, does really good characterization with the characters in his video games. He has plot points and storylines that are so convoluted that this 40-year-old lawyer, who I think has a pretty good curriculum vitae and can usually parse out what a narrative is trying to achieve, his stories are so convoluted that I usually have no idea what he was even aiming at in respect of what he was trying to accomplish. Now, I think I have a pretty good idea what the ending of this particular game was trying to do, so we're going to talk about that. But if it turns out in 5 years or 10 years or whenever Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 comes out that he meant something different, or maybe Square Enix walks it back, I wouldn't blame you. I wouldn't, bet my house on the fact that this interpretation is correct. But to understand what happens, we first have to talk about, we'll talk about this guy, Sephiroth. But I really want to talk about... it looks like I deleted the image. But what I really wanted to talk about was these ghost whisper things. So throughout the game in Final Fantasy VII Remake, you're going to have scenes that play out essentially identically in terms of what happens in them with the original Final Fantasy VII project from 1997. So you're going to have situations where you and Aerith escape the church, and these ghosts are going to be there, and they're essentially going to be blocking off ways that you could have run if you wanted to. And they're going to do things like they're going to save Aerith from falling down off the balcony. And they're going to show up in all these various different scenes, and you're not going to fully understand what's happening with them, except that by the time you're in the chapter where the pillar comes down, by the time you're dealing with these kinds of things, and they prevent you from saving the pillar in Sector 7, you kind of have this understanding of what they are doing. They are clearly flying around and trying to keep you on the path of Final Fantasy VII. They are trying to make it so what you experienced in 1997 happens in this game in this way. And that becomes clearer and clearer, especially as you go through Shinra headquarters, especially as you start dealing with, this cat right here more often. And Sephiroth is in this game, in my opinion, a little bit too much because he is such a popular character in the original Final Fantasy VII, but he's in this game a lot, and essentially what they start to represent is destiny or fate. It's told to you by Red 13 after he communes with Aerith towards the end of the game that these things that are called whispers are essentially trying to enforce what they view as fate. And on a meta-contextual level, it becomes clear that what they are trying to do is they are trying to move the plot in the direction of the original Final Fantasy VII. Now, that's okay, but it means on its face, without even getting into the ending, which we'll get into in a second, that it takes away some of what the characters in the actual game are doing, right? So when, say, Barrett and Tifa decide to do something and they are aided by these whispers, or if they survive an explosion because these whispers are surrounding them, it is a function of predestination. All of this story, all of this narrative is essentially put upon you by someone else, some greater authority, these whisper ghost things, which I also believe are described as the voices of the planet. Again, Nomura, a little bit unclear as to who was talking what, and you're just hearing screaming and you're told that's the voices of the planet and you think it might be the whispers. I think it is the whispers. Who knows? Maybe he'll explain later. Probably not. But it takes away from your agency. Every good story that has a hero fighting a villain, that really has any protagonist do anything, has to be an agent in their own story. When they don't have that agency, the story becomes inert. And I think you do see that in Disney Star Wars, but I won't get into that so much. I have enough content on that particular topic on this channel if you are so interested. But if you don't have that agency, your story becomes inert. And I think these guys do that a little bit. And I think it wasn't really a concern for the makers of this particular game because they are in it for an entirely different reason. They don't much care about agency on this score because the people that love Final Fantasy VII know what's supposed to happen. So when Barrett gets stabbed through the heart by Sephiroth and one of these whispers essentially Dementor faces him and brings him back to life, you say, well, okay, Barrett wasn't supposed to die in that scene. I actually said that to my daughter when it happened. And you say, okay, so that's what's going on with all of this. And then they escape from Midgar on their motorbike, just like in the original. And Sephiroth shows up on the highway and says, essentially, we're going to have to go through this portal that is the barrier that these whispers are creating. And Aerith helps out make that portal, all sorts of convoluted nonsense. But then you have the conversation that really is at the heart of what this project turned out to be. And that is these characters that you've been working with for this entire game essentially saying that we have to fight our fate, because fate is going to lead to these various things that they are seeing or that they're contemplating, such as meteor coming down, such as, again, I gave a spoiler alert a long time ago, but Aerith's death, and we get imagery of and related to her death all over the place throughout this last section of the game. And to me, on the surface, I can understand why the makers of the game wanted to do something like this. It's very meta-contextual. You can almost, as you're playing the game, feel that these ghosts, the people that love Final Fantasy VII, that are over these folks' shoulders as they are making this game, are constantly trying to steer them in one direction, and they don't want to go in that direction. They want to explore other facets of what could have been Final Fantasy VII, and I really do think that meta-context comes across. The problem is that I wanted Final Fantasy VII, and that people wanted Final Fantasy VII, that you get those cheers, you get those sales, you get the marketing, you get the hype, you get the excitement, all because people want to play this project that you made impeccably for 35 hours. And now, what winds up happening in this last chapter is that the main characters of Final Fantasy say, we're going to fight fate. We go through this portal. There's an ominous warning screen that comes up that says, you know, if you go through this, who knows what's on the other side. That very much reminded me, we'll see if I can pull up the right picture this time, but very much reminded me of Stephen King's The Dark Tower. Now, this is also spoilers, but if you want to turn this off for 30 seconds, it's not going to be a long conversation. But in Stephen King's The Dark Tower, basically Roland, the main character of that series, is trying to get to the Dark Tower. And in the very last book, the author, Stephen King, gives a warning that says, you know, this is a perfectly good story right now, and you should essentially close this book if you don't want to know what's in the middle of this tower, because it's going to ruin things for you, and you're not going to love it. And in this particular book, if you continue reading, you find out that it's Stephen King himself at the top of this tower writing this universe, and it's a whole meta-contextual thing. And ultimately, the end of the book is Roland going back to the beginning of the first book, right? And so this reminded me of that, this warning saying, oh, you know, you've played Final Fantasy VII Remake right now. We're going in a different direction. You really want to think about, you know, whether you want to do this. They don't tell you to stop. They say, actually, go make sure your weapons are up to speed and you have all the healing items that you want, and kind of a normal warning, but it's a little bit ominous. And I actually brought up this image because what winds up happening at the end of this chapter is exactly like the failed Dark Tower movie Enterprise, which in that case, as we mentioned, at the end of the original Dark Tower book series, Roland goes back to the beginning, but with this artifact. I think it's the Horn of Eld, if I recall correctly, and I think it's in this article as well. And the movie that was actually made by this, that was starring Idris Elba as Roland, had him have the horn on his hip. And that meant that the movie was essentially a sequel to the books, that what you were going to watch in the movie version was going to be the next rotation, next cycle of the Dark Tower. And at the end of the day, what you wind up getting with this, because these characters at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake are getting all of this imagery. You get one shot of Red 13, which is seemingly from the end, the very end of the original Final Fantasy VII. You get the shots of Holy hitting the ground. You get the shots of Cloud lowering Aerith into the water. Eris in the United States, in my version of Final Fantasy VII. And you get all this stuff, and you get them deciding, we're going to fight that. We don't want that fate. And on a character basis, who can blame them? Who wants a meteor to hit their world? But on a player basis, on what I'm actually doing, what you have now shifted to at the end of Chapter 18 is that now you, person who bought Final Fantasy VII Remake on the first day that it was available, who waited up till midnight to turn it on the first minute you could, is now, as the function of what you are doing, being asked to play against the continuation of a remake of Final Fantasy VII. These characters don't want to have that life. You have gone through a portal that allows you to fight what I think are described in the bestiary as time monsters that have come from the future in which Final Fantasy VII happens and are trying to prevent you from stopping it. And you're going to fight them. And you're going to fight them, and you're going to try to change destiny. You're going to fight fate. Now, yes, I've got this picture up again. I think Square Enix is laughing at us when they do this kind of thing. But also, it's worth noting that it is entirely repetitive of Final Fantasy XIII, whose plot I actually liked. The entirety of that story was about people that were labeled by fate, by a destiny that they could not change, and instead not losing hope and trying to change it anyway. And that made sense. That was the story of Final Fantasy XIII from the beginning to the end. Here, you have Final Fantasy VII up until a point, and then you have the character saying, I don't want this game. I want out of this game. Who could possibly want this? The answer is me. I wanted that. But it very much appears like we're not going to get that. Because at the end of Chapter 18, you wind up beating back the Whispers, you wind up beating back Sephiroth, and it's a little unclear what happens, except that Zack, the enigmatic character counterpoint to Cloud, is alive and walking towards Midgar in a scene that doesn't appear in the original 1997 version of Final Fantasy VII, and whose import is a little bit unclear in general on its faith. Because at the very end of the game, you have him walking past the crew as they leave Midgar, and it's unclear whether it's a separate timeline, whether it's a memory, whether it's something else entirely. And the very last message that they give you at all is that the unknown journey or unknown adventure will continue, with the premise being that we are now going to go. We've got this world, we've got planet, we've got Sephiroth and Jenova and these other elements, but we are no longer going to tell you Final Fantasy VII. We're going to tell you something different. And to really put a button on that, even before they give you that message, they've got all these whispers, all these ghost things, and some really cool shots, some really cool imagery surrounding Shinra headquarters, surrounding all of Midgar. And when you beat back Sephiroth, and you have some weird kind of Neon Genesis Evangelion scene at the end where you're talking about fate and destiny, and you refuse to join with Sephiroth to fight that fate, when you beat all of that, the whispers disappear, turn to golden flakes with some nice music, and the implication with Biggs alive, with some other things that you see with Zack alive, is that you have changed fate, or more specifically, that fate and destiny no longer apply. That the clear messaging to me, and I think this is right, is that you were on these trails, you were on these tracks, the train we're on don't make no stops, and we took you all the way through this point. And now we're going in a different direction. We're going to do something completely different from what you know, what you're expecting. Yeah, maybe we've got the various weapons in various spots. Maybe there's a meteor spell. Maybe there's a holy. And that's not what I signed on for, right? Final Fantasy VII Remake is named Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I always thought was a bit uncouth or sounded like a project model, because it's literally about Sephiroth trying to remake Final Fantasy VII with the help of Destiny, and you fighting against that. That your characters that are in Final Fantasy VII don't want to have the entirety of the plot remade, hey, because that was a pretty traumatic experience for all of them. And again, as characterization, I don't blame them, but this is absolutely ridiculous as a sales pitch for something that people have been waiting for so long. You know, I go back to it being like Game of Thrones. I loved Game of Thrones for so long. And they leave the source material, and it dies in a fire. And I can't even bear to think of watching the seasons that I loved before. And I'm sitting here right now, and my opinion might change in the next few days. I'm doing this live because I wanted to talk to you all about it. I wanted to get my thoughts out there because I love this series, Final Fantasy, and I love this game so much in particular that I wanted to actually get this out while it was still fresh in my head. But I can't imagine going back and playing that. And literally yesterday, I was thinking, oh, all right, maybe they'll do another difficulty mode, which they do, or maybe I can go and look at some other stuff and I can really pause and really slow walk through these various locations and get every single conversation, and I can spread it out for the time between now and the next part. And it's going to be great. And I can't even fathom doing that right now. So, yeah, it's interesting. You know, they're clever. They want to do something different. And I don't blame them from that from a creative perspective. I blame them for that, for getting our hopes up, for getting all of Final Fantasy VII. And then, goddamn them, for doing it so well that I say, oh, I can't wait to see Cosmo Canyon. Oh, the Gold Saucer is going to be great. I can't wait to go on this plotline because there's so much good stuff in Final Fantasy VII. And hey, maybe they're going to copy some of it. Maybe this is going to be like J.J. Abrams in the Star Trek universe. And you just get random, like maybe Benedict Cumberbatch will show up as Khan in part 2. I don't know. But it very much feels like they want to do that kind of stuff. And that's not what I wanted. That's not the project that I wanted. I would have bought 5 games at full price or deluxe editions of them just getting from point A to point Z in Final Fantasy VII. And instead I sit here and say, oh my God, what have you done? Because why? What are you going to sell in terms of part 2? What is that going to look like? Yeah, we're going to see some other places, but it's going to be a completely new experience. I'm sure that's what they will market it as. But hey, I didn't want that. And I would strongly suspect that the people that were most excited about this project didn't want that either. And so, yeah, if they issued a patch that essentially lopped off the very end of Chapter 18 and just had you right out on that highway, right to where you're looking out back at Midgar and saying, oh, we're going to have to go after Sephiroth, we're going to have to go figure things out because Genova's out and there's a whole lot of problems we've got. If they just did that, if they lopped off a section of the game, honestly, I would love it. I would be super thrilled that that is what they chose to do. Because the alternative is taking something like The Lord of the Rings and saying, you love The Lord of the Rings. We're going to re-examine that story. And saying, yeah, we're going to re-examine it. We're going to call it The Lord of the Rings. It's going to be a reimagining. We've got a new cast. It's going to be great. We've got some better special effects. Oh, except that when everybody stops in Rivendell and you get a little bit of backstory about Isildur refusing to throw the ring into the fire, Gandalf has a time spell. And he's going to send Frodo back in time to Mount Doom, and Frodo's going to throw the ring in the volcano right then. Because, hey, he can see the future, and he wants to avoid that future. And let's be honest, a lot of people die. A lot of bad things happen after Isildur refuses to throw the ring into the volcano. And so Gandalf has a time spell. He can send Frodo back. Frodo sends it in. It makes sense for the characters if they have this opportunity to do this thing. Oh, and also, whatever comes after this in the future movies is going to be not The Lord of the Rings. I hope you're happy. Would you be happy? I know I'm not, with respect to what Final Fantasy VII has sold. They've sold essentially a version of The Matrix 2, the much beloved second entry in the Matrix trilogy, in which the architect reveals to Neo that he is but one of many the ones that have come forth and have been able to do what they do, and that the system actually uses that to its advantage, and that if he goes through this other door, he's going to try to fight the system and fight destiny and fate. That is an okay plotline if that is the centerpiece of your story. If something like The Matrix 2 doesn't already exist and you're otherwise enjoying the story that you already know, that its story actually is breaking away from fate. And now the Final Fantasy VII Remake's project story is breaking away from fate, just like Final Fantasy 13, just like Final Fantasy 15 to an extent. Square Enix has some kind of overwhelming issue with fate and destiny and predestination, and I suggest they go see a therapist to talk it through. But either way, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Sephiroth's attempt to remake Final Fantasy VII, is now no longer what we were expecting, no longer what we were sold. There's every reason to believe that it won't be what we were expecting or what we were sold. And so, at the same time that they gave us everything we could possibly have wanted with respect to Final Fantasy VII, they took it away at the exact same time. And I look back and say, my goodness, I feel like I was tricked. And that's never a feeling you want to have at the end of your game. So, that's about what I wanted to say with respect to Final Fantasy VII. That's the postmortem. There were some other things that popped up in my playthrough. The Aerith voice never really worked for me. It's a little bit too Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter, for my liking. Very kind of weird, and then kind of randomly bubbly. So I didn't really like it. Everybody else worked perfectly. I absolutely adore Tifa as depicted in this game. I love Cloud. Barrett's a little bit too much, and like I said, he's got a potty mouth on him. But that's pretty much fitting with what his original character was. So with the exception of Aerith's voice, I really didn't have much issue with what they actually put together, put out there. The graphics are wonderful. The music is wonderful, just like I said. But at the end of the day, I don't know that there's anything to look forward to for me for the remainder of this project. And that ultimately just feels like a great disappointment that you had this opportunity. Not only did you have this opportunity, you were hitting it. You were doing it. And then it just went away. And so we're left with, we can do it if we wanted to. But we're not gonna because we don't want to. And that feels, as much as anything, like a kick in the pants. So that's what we've got. That's what I had to say about this in terms of a postmortem, in terms of Final Fantasy VII Remake. I enjoyed so much of it. while I was playing it, I was actually thinking about potentially doing postmortems for each of the chapters because I loved them so much. And I thought there was stuff to really dig into with respect to how they had split things up, exactly how good their dungeons were, what they were doing with them, how good the battle system was in respect of changing up the various attacks. But at this point in time, I'm left shrugging and saying, you know what? Maybe my daughter and I will play the original Final Fantasy VII. I'll work on my voices for the various characters, and she'll have to do some heavy lifting as well because there's just way too much text in there to have me speak it all. But that's Final Fantasy VII, one of my favorite games of all time. Final Fantasy VII Remake is almost one of my favorite games of all time, and then it decides not to be, almost as some kind of offensive joke. And that's what this postmortem is. That's what this postmortem has been about. I see I've got a couple people watching right now. If there's any thoughts that you have about what I've said, anything you want clarified, any questions I can answer, I would be more than happy to do that. Please flag it with an @HoegLaw because I can see it. It pops for me on my chat a little bit better. Otherwise, that's probably it for me. That's probably it for what I want to talk about. I've got some people here that are just generally talking about what I was saying. And then what did they do to my childhood? They didn't do anything to your childhood. The original will still exist. But what they didn't do is they didn't enhance your childhood. They didn't take what you loved, make it better, as clearly seems is within their capability of doing so. As Sophia Narwitz here says, 3/4 of it was great, but oof, that ending. I think 17.5/18 of it was great. Sophia? I mean, like, I literally could stop right at the end of the highway, not go in that portal, and be like, man, that was great. What a game. But yeah, let's go into the weird portal and fight all sorts of nonsense. My daughter was actually, while we were playing that chapter, saying, are you sure this wasn't in your version of the game, Dad? Because this seems like a lot of effort. This seems like a lot of production as part of all this. And I said, no, honey, we weren't jumping across half broken up buildings, and Sephiroth never threw the Shinra Tower at us while fighting time beasts from the future to prevent fate and destiny from making us go through Final Fantasy VII, which is why I'm here anyway. Nope, we never did that. So, still recommend the original over the remake. So, the remake is so fantastic in parts. It really is fantastic in parts. And I think it's a great experience as long as you don't assume that it is going to be the rest of Final Fantasy. I love it. I love the new music. I was thinking about potentially buying that however many disc set, the 11 disc set that they're releasing of all this music from the new game. But yeah, in terms of a cohesive narrative, in terms of a story that makes some modicum of sense, in terms of what you wanted, Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake are different products. They're just different. So that's where it's gonna be. Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I've got. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this. I'm trying not to be too despondent. It's a video game. But I will be honest, it's a very rough time here in 2020. A lot of us in the Hoeg house were holding out for April 10th. We got Trolls World Tour. We got Final Fantasy VII Remake. And then to have it meet all those expectations for what amounts to 3.5 days, 4 days, and then to just trip over the finish line is, it's a shame. In any event, thank you all for joining me. Thank you for checking this out. I'm glad that a number of you got a chance to discuss it with me, to talk with me about all these various things. If you ever want to hit me up on Twitter, I'm at HoegLaw, HoegLaw, to chat about these things. I've already DM'd with a few folks because I don't like to talk publicly about the spoiler information here. But there's a lot to unpack. It's still a good game. It's just not Final Fantasy VII, and man, that's a shame. Thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it, and I will catch you on the next Virtual Legality. Please check out the rest of the channel. Like, subscribe, engage, comment, do all that good stuff. We're trying to grow this channel as much as possible, and we like having these conversations about things like this, as well as things like Supreme Court cases. We do it all here on Hoeg Law. Thanks again.